The third in this series, this live reading of The Bell Witch, A Mysterious Spirit by Charles Bailey Bell. He is the great grandson of John Bell, who this actually happened to. So just to get you caught up and see, if you haven't seen the first two, the Bell family moved to Tennessee in 1804, and about 15 years later, they were being harassed by this spirit. Not necessarily a ghost. They called it, the neighborhood and the people around it nicknamed it the witch, the Bell Witch. They didn't ever call it that. I definitely suggest go back and watch the first two, because that goes into a history all about that, how they never really called it, the family didn't call it the witch. This one is a big, big, big chapter. It is really long. I don't know if I'm gonna get through all of it tonight, but I really don't think I'm gonna have to split this up and go through it, tomorrow and finish it tomorrow night. Recollections of Richard Williams Bell. Now, Richard Williams Bell was one of the boys. He was a younger brother to Betsy. After settling on the Red River in Robertson County, Tennessee, my father prospered beyond his expectations. He was a good manager and a hard worker himself, making a regular hand on the farm. He indulged no idleness around him and brought up his children to work, endeavoring to make their employment pleasurable. Mother was equally frugal and careful in her domestic affairs, and was greatly devoted to the proper moral training of her children, keeping a restless watch over everyone, making sacrifices for their pleasure and well-being, and both were steadfast in their religious faith, being members of the Baptist Church, and set Christian examples before their children. Father was always forehanded, paid as he went, and never in his life served with a warrant or any legal process, and never had occasion to fear the sheriff or any officer of the law, and was equally faithful in bearing his share of whatever burden was necessary to advance morality in good society. In the meanwhile, he gave all of his children the best of education the schools of the country could afford, Zadok being educated for a lawyer, while the other boys chose to follow agriculture. Jesse and Esther had both married, settled, and everything seemed to be going smoothly when our trouble commenced. I was a boy when the incidents which I am about to record, known as the Bell Witch, took place. In fact, strange appearances and uncommon sounds had been seen and heard by different members of the family at times some year or two before I knew anything about it, because they indicated nothing of a serious character, gave no one any concern, and would have passed unnoticed but for after developments. Even the knocking on the door and the outer walls of the house had been going on for some time before I knew of it, generally being asleep and father believing that it was some mischievous person trying to frighten the family, never discussed the matter in the presence of the younger children, hoping to catch the prankster. Then, after the demonstrations became known to all of us, father enjoined secrecy upon every member of the family, and it was kept a profound secret until it became intolerable. Therefore, no notes were made of these demonstrations or the exact dates. The importance of a diary at that time did not occur to anyone, for we were all subjected to the most intense and painful excitement from day to day, week to week, to the end, not knowing from whence came the distributor, the object of the visitation, what would follow next, how long it would continue, nor the probable result. Therefore, I write from memory such things as came under my observation, impressing my mind and incidents known by other members of the family and near neighbors to have taken place and are absolutely true. However, I do not pretend to record the half that did take place, for that would be impossible without daily notes, but will note a sufficient number of incidents to give the reader a general idea of the phenomena and the afflictions endured by our family. As before stated, the knocking at the door and the scratching noise on the outer wall, which continued so long, never disturbed me, nor was I frightened until the demonstrations within became unendurable. This, I think, was in May 1818. Father and mother occupied a room on the first floor. Elizabeth had the room above, and the boys occupied another room on the second floor. John and Drury had a bed together, and Joel and myself slept in another bed. As I remember, it was on a Sunday night. Just after the family had retired, a noise commenced in our room like a rat gnawing vigorously on the bedpost. John and Drury got up to kill the rat, but the moment they were out of bed, the noise ceased. They examined the bedstead, but discovered no marks by a rat. So soon they returned to bed, the noise commenced again, and thus continued until a late hour, or sometime after midnight, and we were all up a half a dozen times more, searching the room all over, every nook and corner for the rat, turning over everything, and could find nothing, not even a crevice by which a rat could enter. This kind of noise continued from night to night and week after week, and all of our investigations were in vain. The room was overhauled several times, everything moved and carefully examined with the same result. Finally, we would search for the rat in our room. The same noise would appear in Sister Elizabeth's chamber, disturbing her and arousing all the family. And so it continued, going from room to room, stopping when we were all up, and commencing again so soon as we returned to bed, and was so exceedingly annoying that no one could sleep. The noise was, after a while, accompanied by a scratching sound, like a dog clawing on the floor, and increased in force until it became evidently too strong for a rat. Then every room in the house was torn up, the furniture, beds, clothing carefully examined, and still nothing irregular could be found. Nor was there a hole or a crevice by which a rat could enter. And nothing was accomplished beyond the increase of our confusion and evil forebodings. The demonstrations continued to increase, and finally the bed coverings commenced slipping off at the foot of the beds, as if gradually drawn by someone, and occasionally a noise like the smacking of lips, then a gulping sound, like someone choking or strangling, while the vicious gnawing at the bedpost continued, and there was no such thing as a sleep-through to be thought of until the noise ceased, which was generally between 1 and 3 o'clock in the morning. Some new performance was added nearly every night, and it troubled Elizabeth more than anyone else. Occasionally the sound was like heavy stones falling on the floor, then like the traced chains digging, dragging, chairs falling over. I called to mind my first lively experience, something a boy is not likely to ever forget. We had become somewhat used to the mysterious noise and tried to dismiss it from mind, taking every opportunity for a nap. The family had all retired early, and I had just fallen into a sweet doze when I felt my hair beginning to twist. Then a sudden jerk which raised me. It felt like the top of my head had been taken off. Immediately Joel yelled out in a great fright, and next Elizabeth was screaming in her room. And ever after that something was continually pulling at her hair after she retired to bed. This transaction frightened us so badly that Father and Mother remained up nearly all night. After this, the main feature in the phenomena was that of the pulling of cover off the beds as fast as we could replace it, also continuing other demonstrations. Failing in all efforts to discover the source of the annoyance and become convinced that it was something out of the natural course of events, continually on the increase in force, Father finally determined to solicit the cooperation of Mr. James Johnston, who was the nearest neighbor and most intimate friend, in trying to detect the mystery which had been kept secret with the family up to this time. So Mr. Johnston and wife, at Father's request, came over and spent a night in the investigation. At the usual hour for retiring, Mr. Johnston, who was a very devout Christian, led the family in worship as was his custom, reading a chapter in the Bible, singing and praying. He prayed fervently and very earnestly for our deliverance from this frightful disturbance, and that its origin, cause, and purpose might be revealed. Soon after we had all retired, the disturbance commenced as usual, gnawing, scratching, and knocking on the walls, overturning chairs, pulling off the beds, etc., every act being exhibited as if on purpose to show Mr. Johnston what could be done, appearing in his room as in other rooms, and so on. As the light would appear, the noise would cease, and the trouble begin in another room. Mr. Johnson listened attentively to all the sounds and capers, and that which appeared like someone sucking in air through the teeth, the smacking of lips, indicted him to that some intelligent agency gave force to these movements, and he determined to try to speak to it, which he did, inquiring, "In the name of the Lord, what or who are you? What do you want, and why are you here?" This appeared to silence the noise for a considerable time, but it finally commenced again with increased vigor, pulling the covers from the beds in spite of all the resistance, repeating other demonstrations, going from one room to another, becoming fearful. The persecutions of Elizabeth were increased to the extent that they excited serious apprehensions. Her cheeks were frequently crimsoned as a hard blow from an open hand, and her hair pulled until she would scream with pain. Mr. Johnson said the phenomenon was beyond his comprehension, as it was evidently preternatural or supernatural, of an intelligent character. He arrived at this conclusion from the fact that it ceased action when spoken to, and certainly understood language. He advised Father to invite other friends into the investigation and try all means for detecting the mystery, to which he consented, and from this time it became public. All of our neighbors were invited and committees formed, experiments tried, and a close watch kept in and out every night. But if all their wits were stifled in the demonstrations, all the while increasing in force, and sister was so severely punished that Father and Mother became alarmed for her safety when alone, and the neighboring girls came almost every night to keep her company. Especially were Fanny Thorne and Rebecca Porter very courageous and kind to her in this trying ordeal. It was suggested that sister should spend the nights with some of the neighbors to get rid of the trouble, and all were very kind to invite her. In fact, our neighbors were all touched with generous sympathy and were unremitting in their efforts to alleviate her distress, for it had become a calamity, and they came every night to sit and watch with us. The suggestion of sending Elizabeth from home was acted upon. She went to different places, James Johnston's, John Johnston's, Jessie Bell's, Bennett Porter's, but it made no difference. The trouble following her wherever she went with the same severity, disturbing the family where she went as it did our home, nor were we in any way relieved. This gave rise to a suspicion that, in the minds of some persons, that the mystery was some device or stratagem originated by sister, from the fact that it appeared wherever she went, and this clue was followed to a logical demonstration of the mistake, satisfying all who entered the investigation. After Mr. James Johnston expressed his opinion that there was an intelligent cause behind these manifestations, other persons commenced speaking with the witch, as it was then called, importuning it to talk and tell what it wanted. When spoken to, it was observed that the noise would cease for a time, and then appear still more demonstrative. This conduct went to confirm Mr. Johnston's opinion, and investigators persisted with interrogations. By this time, the mystery had gained wide notoriety, and people came from every direction, the house being crowded every night with visitors who came to witness demonstrations, and neighbors persevered in their efforts to induce the witch to talk, calling on it to rap on the wall, smack its mouth, etc., and in this way the phenomena was gradually developed, proving to be an intelligent character. When asked a question in a way that it could be answered by numbers, for instance, how many persons present, how many horses in the barn, or how many miles to a certain place, the answers would come in raps, like a man knocking on the wall, the bureau or the bedpost with his fist, or by so many scratches on the wall, like the noise of a nail or claws, and the answers were invariably correct. During the time that it was not uncommon to see lights, or like a candle or lamps, flitting across the yard through the field, and frequently when Father, the boys, and hands were coming late from work, chunks of wood and stones would fall along the way as if tossed by someone, but we never could discover from whence or what direction they came. In addition, the demonstrations already described, it took to slapping people on the face, especially those who resisted the action of pulling the cover from the bed, and those who came as detectives to expose the trick. The blows were heard distinctly, like the open palm of a heavy hand, while the sting was keenly felt, and it did not neglect to pull any hair and make Joel squall often. The phenomena continued to develop force, and visitors persisted in urging the witch to talk and tell what was wanted, and finally commenced at whistling when spoken to in a low, broken sound, as if trying to speak in a whistling voice. And in this way it progressed, developing until the whistling sound changed to a weak, faltering whisper, uttering indistinct words. The voice, however, gradually gained strength in articulating, and soon utterances became distinct in a low whisper, so as to be understood in the absence of any other noises. I do not remember the first intelligent utterance, which, however, was of no significance, but the voice soon developed sufficient strength to be distinctly heard by everyone in the room. This new development added to the sensation already created. The news spread and people came in larger numbers. Anxiety concerning the mystery prompted many questions in the effort to induce the witch to disclose its own identity and purpose. Finally, in an answer to the question, "Who are you and what do you want?" the reply came, "I am a spirit. I was once very happy but have been disturbed." This was uttered in a very feeble voice, but sufficiently distinct to be understood by all present. And this was the information that could be elicited from time to time. The next utterance of any note that I remember occurred on a Sunday night, when the voice appeared stronger, and the witch talking more freely, in fact, speaking voluntarily, and appeared to be exercised over a matter that had been discussed by the family. Brother John Bell had for some time contemplated a trip to North Carolina to look after Father's share of an estate that was being wound up, and was to start the next morning on a Monday on horseback, and this was the matter that interested the family and was being discussed. The long, tiresome journey had his probable long absence, the situation of affairs concerning which Father was giving him instruction. Several neighbors were present, taking an interest, volunteering some good-natured advice to John, when the witch put in, remonstrating against the trip, dissuading John from going, predicting bad luck, telling him he would have a hard trip for nothing, that the estate had not been wound up, could not be for some time, he would get no money, but return empty-handed. As further argument to dissuade John, the witch told him that an elegant young lady from Virginia was then on her way to visit friends in Robertson County, who would please him, and he could win her if he would stay, that she was wealthy and had considerable money. John laughed at the revelation as supremely ridiculous, and left on the following morning as contemplated, and was absent 6 months or more, returning empty-handed as predicted. Very soon after his departure, the young lady in question arrived and left before his return, and John never met her. The witch continued to develop the power of articulation, talking freely, and those who engaged in conversation with the invisible persevered in plying questions to draw out explanation of the mystery. And again the questions were pressed, inquiring, "Who are you and what do you want?" The witch replied, stating the second time, "I am a spirit who was once very happy, but have been disturbed and made unhappy." Then followed the question, "How were you disturbed? What makes you unhappy?" The reply to this question was, "I am the spirit of a person who is buried in the woods nearby, but the grave has been disturbed, my bones disinterred and scattered, and one of my teeth was lost under this house. I am here looking for my tooth." The statement revived a memory of circumstance which occurred some 3 or 4 years previously and had been entirely forgotten. The farm hands, when engaged in clearing a plot of land, discovered a small mound of graves, which Father supposed to be an Indian burying ground, and worked around it without obliterating the marks. Several days later, Corbin Hall, a young man of the neighborhood, came to our place and was told by Drew the circumstance of finding the Indian graves. Hall thought probably the graves contained some relics in which Indians commonly buried with their dead, and proposed to open one and see, which Drew agreed, and they proceeded to disinter the bones. Finding nothing else, Hall brought the jawbone to the house, and while sitting in the passage, he threw it against the opposite wall and jarred a tooth loose, which dropped through a crack in the floor. Father passed through the hall in the meantime and reprimanded the boys severely for their actions, and made one of the Negro men take the jawbone back, replacing all of the disinterred bones, and fill the grave. This was evidently the circumstance referred to by the spirit, so long forgotten, and to be reminded of the fact that so mysteriously, very perplexing, and troubled Father no little. He examined the floor just where the bone had been dropped when it struck the wall, as the boys had left it, and there was a crack. And when he was pestered, he decided to take up a portion of the floor and see if the tooth could be found. The dirt underneath was raked up, sifted, and thoroughly examined, but the tooth was not found. The witch laughed at Father, declaring that it was all a joke to fool old Jack. The excitement in the country increased as the phenomena developed. The fame of the witch had become widely spread, and people from all quarters to hear the strange and unaccountable voice. Some were detectives, confident of exposing the mystery. Various opinions were formed and expressed. Some credited its own story, believed in an Indian spirit. Some thought it was an evil spirit. Others declared it was witchcraft. And a few unkindly charged that it was a magic art and trickery gotten up by the Bell family to draw crowds and make money. These same people had stayed as long as they wished, enjoyed Father's hospitality, and paid not 1 cent for it. Nor did it ever cost anyone half a shilling. The house was open to everyone that came. Father and Mother gave them their best they had. Their horses were fed, and no one allowed to go away hungry. Many offered to pay, and no one and urged Father to receive it, insisting that he could not keep up entertaining so many without pay. But he persistently declined remuneration, and not one of the family ever received a cent for entertaining. Father regarded the phenomena as a affliction, a calamity, and such accusations were very galling, but were endured. Inquisitive people continued to exercise all of their wits, plying the witch with questions concerning its personality or character, but elicited no further information until the question was put to James Gunn. Then came the reply: I am the spirit of an early immigrant who brought a large sum of money and buried my treasure for safekeeping until needed. In the meantime, I died without divulging the secret. And I have returned in the spirit for the purpose of making known the hiding place, and I want to give Betsy Bell the money. The spirit was then urged to tell where the money was concealed. This was refused, and the secret withheld until pledges were made that the conditions would be complied with. The conditions were that Drew Bell and Bennett Porter would agree to exhume the money and give every dollar to Betsy, and that old sugarmouth, Mr. James Johnston, would go with them and see that the injunction was fairly discharged, and that he should count the money and take charge of it for Betsy. The story was questioned and laughed at, then discussed. The witch had made some remarkable revelations, and it was thought that there might be something to it, and the proposition was acceded to. Drew and Bennett agreed to do the work, and Mr. Johnson consented to become a guardian and see that the right thing was done. The spirit then went on to state that the money was under a large flat rock at the mouth of the spring on the southwest corner of the farm on Red River, describing the surroundings so minutely there could be no mistake. Everyone was acquainted with the spring, having frequented the place, but no one could have described it so minutely. And this all tended to strengthen the faith in the revelation. The spirit insisted that the committee selected should start very early in the next morning at the dawn of day, lest the secret should get out and some fiend beat them to the place and get the money. This was also agreed to, and by the break of day next morning, all hands met and proceeded to the spring. They found everything as described, the huge stone intact, and were sure they were on time. They observed that it was an excellent place for hiding money, that where no human being would ever dream of looking for treasure, or care to move the great stone for any purpose, and yet susceptible of such minute description that no one could be mistaken in the revelation. They carried a long axe and a mattock and were pretty soon at work, devising ways and means for moving the big rock, which was so firmly embedded in the ground. It was no light job, but they cut poles, made levers, and fixed prizes, after first removing such dirt from around the stone so as to get under it. Then Drew and Porter prized and tugged, Mr. Johnston occasionally lending a helping hand, and after half a day's very hard work, the stone was raised and moved from its bedding, but no money appeared. Then followed a consultation and discussion of the situation. They reasoned that the glittering treasure was possibly sunk into the earth, and the stone embedded over it to elude suspicion. And they decided to dig for it and went to work in earnest. Porter digging and Drew scratching at the loose dirt out with his hands. And so on they progressed until they had opened a hole 6 feet square and nearly as many feet deep, and still no money was found. Exhausted and very hungry, they gave up the job, returning to the house in the afternoon, much disgusted and chagrined. That night, the spirit appeared in great glee, laughing and tantalizing the men for being so easily duped, and described in every way everything that had occurred at the spring in a most ludicrous way, telling how they tugged at the big stone and repeating what was said by everyone. Bennett Porter stayed the mattock up to the eye, every pop, and oh, how it made him sweat. It told how old Sugarmouth looked on prayerfully, encouraging the boys. The dirt taken out was mixed with small stones, gravel, sand, etc., leaves, sticks, all of which indicated that the earth had been removed and put back. Drew, the witch said, could handle the sight of dirt. His hands were made for that purpose and were better than a shovel. No gold could slip through his fingers. The witch's description of the affair kept the house in an uproar of laughter, and it was repeated with equal zest to all newcomers for a month. There were but very few churches in the country at this period in the century. Nevertheless, ours was a very religious community. Most of those coming from the older states brought their religion with them and inculcated the principle in their families. The influence of Reverend James Thomas Gunn, Reverend Sugg Fort, Mr. James Johnston, and other good men swayed mightily. Every man erected an altar in his own home, and it was common for neighbors to meet during the week at one another's house and pray for prayer and exhortation of the Bible. In the absence of the preachers, Mr. James Johnston was the principal leader in these exercises, and the meetings were held alternately at his house and father's, and occasionally at one or the other of the Gunns. There was no spirit of denominational jealousy existing, and all Christians mingled in these meetings like brethren of the same faith. The witch, as it accumulated force, dissembled this spirit, giving wonderful exhibitions of thorough knowledge of the Bible and Christian faith. The voice was not confined to darkness, as were the physical demonstrations. The talking was heard in lighted rooms, as in the dark, and finally in the day at any hour. The first exhibition of a real religious nature was the assimilation of Mr. Johnston's character and worship, repeating the song and prayer, uttering precisely the same petition made by the old gentleman that night. He and his wife came for the purpose of investigation, and the impersonation of Mr. Johnston was so perfect that it appeared like himself present. It was not uncommon after this for the witch to introduce worship by lining a hymn, as was the custom, singing it through, and then repeat Mr. Johnston's prayer or the petitions of some of the ministers. It could sing any song in the hymn books of that time and quote any passage of scripture in the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. The propensity for religious discussions was strongly manifested, and in quoting scripture, the text was invariably correctly cited, and if anyone misquoted a verse, they would promptly be corrected. It could quote scripture as fast as it could talk, one text after the other, citing the book, chapter, and number of the verse. It was common to test the open Bible at any chapter and call on spirit to repeat a certain verse, and this was done accurately as fast as the leaves were turned from one chapter of the book to the other. It delighted in taking issue on religious subjects with those well versed in scripture, and was sure to get the best of the argument, being always quick with the passage to sustain its point. This manifest knowledge of the scripture on the part of the witch was unmistakable, and was the most mystifying of all developments. And strangers who came from a long distance were eager to engage in the seer in religious discussions, and were no less astounded by when the witch would remind them of events and circumstances in their history in a way that was marvelous. Just here one circumstance I shall recall to mind, the discussion that had turned on command against covetousness and theft. A man whose name I will call John put in, remarking that he did not believe there was any sin in stealing something to eat when one was reduced to hunger and could not obtain food for his labor. Instantly, the witch perniciously inquired of John if he ate that sheepskin. This settled John. He was dumb as an oyster, and as soon as the subject was changed, he left the company and was conspicuously absent after that. The result was the revival of an old scandal, so long past it had been forgotten, in which John was accused of stealing a sheepskin. This warlock was indeed a great tattler and made mischief in the community. Some people very much feared the garrulity and the loquaciousness, meddling, and were extremely cautious, and it was this class whom the invisible delighted in torturing the most. Nothing of the moment occurred in the county or any family that was not reported by the witch at night. The development of the characteristic led the people to inquire after the news and converse with the witch as they would with a person, very often inquiring on what was transpiring then at a certain place or house in the neighborhood. Sometimes the answer would be, I don't know, wait a minute and I will go and see. And in less than 5 minutes, a report back, and the report was generally verified. This feature of the phenomenon was discovered in this way. Brother Jesse Bell lived within 1 mile of the homestead. He had been absent several days on a trip and was expected home on a certain evening. After supper, Mother entered the room, inquiring if any of us knew whether Jesse had returned or not. No one had heard or could inform her. The witch manifested much regard for Mother on all occasions and never afflicted her in any way. On this occasion it spoke promptly, saying, Wait a minute, Luce, I will go and see for you. Scarcely a minute had elapsed when the voice reported that Jesse was at home, describing his position sitting at a table, reading by the light of a candle. The next morning Jesse came to see us, and when told the circumstance, he said it was true, and just at that time there was a distinct rap at his door, and before he could move, the door opened and closed immediately. His wife noticed it also, and asked him what had caused it, and he replied that he reckoned it was the witch. Every Sabbath service that occurred within the bounds was reported at night, the text, hymn, and etc. And the preacher was also criticized, and everything of peculiar note was described. The company was treated one night to a repetition of one of James Gunn's best sermons, preached in the vicinity, the witch personating Mr. Gunn, lining the hymn, quoting his text in prayer, and preaching much like Mr. Gunn, that it appeared the minister himself was present. A number of persons were present who attended the meeting that day and recognized the declamation as the same sermon. Shortly after this, Reverend James Gunn preached on a Sunday at Bethel Methodist Church, 6 miles southeast, and Reverend Sugg Fort filled his appointment at Drake's Pond Baptist Church, 7 miles northwest, 13 miles apart, both preaching at the same hour, 11 o'clock. It so happened that both ministers came to visit our family that evening. Finding quite a crowd of people gathered in, as was the case every day during the excitement, directly after supper the witch commenced talking as usual, directing the conversation to Brother Gunn, discussing some points of his sermon that day. Mr. Gunn asked the witch how it knew what he had preached about. The answer was, I was present and heard you. The statement being questioned, the vociferator began, quoted the text, and repeated the sermon verbatim, and the closing prayer, all of which the preacher said was correct. Someone suggested that Brother Fort had the advantage of the witch this time, saying that he attended Brother Gunn's service. It could tell nothing about Brother Fort's discourse at Drake's Pond. Yes, I can, was the prompt reply. How do you know, was the inquiry. I was there and heard him. Then, assuming Reverend Fort's style, it proceeded to quote his text and repeated his sermon, greatly delighting the company. There was no one present who had heard either sermon, but both ministers admitted that their sermons had been accurately reproduced and that no one could ever doubt the fact or were more greatly surprised than themselves. The reader will understand that no feature of the exhibitions already introduced was ever abandoned, but continued, developing virulence or beneficence and felicity. The practice of pulling the cover off the beds was a favorite pastime, and frequently the sheets would be pulled from under the sleepers, or the pillows jerked from under the heads, and other performances added to the exhibitions. The most mysterious consequence, however, was the afflictions of Elizabeth and father. Notwithstanding the invisible agency feigned a tender regard at times for Betsy, as it affectionately called her, it did not cease tormenting her in many ways, increasing her punishment. The faint pretext for this was a manifest opposition to the attention paid her by a certain young gentleman who was much esteemed by the family, often interposing impertinent objections, urging that these mutual relations be severed. At least there was no other cause manifested, or this would not be mentioned. Sister was now subjected to fainting spells, followed by prostration, characterized by shortness of breath and smothering sensations, panting as if for her life, and becoming entirely exhausted and lifeless, losing her breath for nearly a minute between gasps, and was rendered unconscious. These spells lasted from 30 to 40 minutes and passed off suddenly, leaving her perfectly restored for a few minutes, in which she recovered from the exhaustion. There is no positive evidence that these spells were produced by the witch. However, that was the conclusion. From the fact that there was no other apparent cause, she was a very stout girl, with this exception, the personification of robust health, and was never subject to hysteria of any kind. Moreover, the spells came on at irregular hours of the evening, just as the time the witch would usually appear. And immediately after the spells passed off, the mysterious voice commenced talking, but never uttered a word during the time of her prostration. In the meantime, father was strangely afflicted, which should have been mentioned in the outset, but he had never regarded his trouble as of any consequence until after sister recovered from the attacks just described. In fact, his ailment commenced with the incipiency of the witch demonstration, or before he recognized the phenomenal disturbance. He complained of a curious sensational feeling in his mouth, a stiffness of the tongue, and something like a stick crosswise punching each side of his jaws. The sensation did not last long, did not recur very often, or cause pain, and therefore gave him but little concern. But as the phenomenon developed, this affliction increased. His tongue swelled against his jaw so that he could neither talk nor eat for 10 to 15 hours. In the meantime, the witch manifested a pernicious dislike for father, using the most vile and malignant epithets toward him, declaring that it would torment old Jack Bell to the end of his life. As father's troubles increased, Elizabeth was gradually relieved from her severe spells, and soon recovered entirely from the affliction, and never had another symptom of any kind. But father was seized with another malady that caused him much trouble and suffering. This was contortions of his face, a twitching and dancing of his flesh, which laid him up for the time. These spells gradually increased and undoubtedly carried him to his grave, of which I will have more to say further on. People continued to ply our loquacious visitor with shrewd eater questions, trying to elicit some information concerning the mystery, which were with equal dexterity evaded, or a misleading answer given. First, it was a disturbed spirit hunting a lost tooth. Next, a spirit that had returned to reveal a hiding place of a buried treasure. Then it told old Calvin Johnson it was the spirit of a child buried in North Carolina, and told John Johnston that it was his stepmother's witch. At last, James Gunn manifested a very inquisitive desire to penetrate the greatest of all secrets, and put the question very earnestly. The witch replied, saying that Brother Gunn had put the question in such a way that it could no longer be evaded, and it would not do to tell the preacher a flat lie, and if the plain truth must be known, it was nobody else, and nothing but old Kate Bat's witch, determined to torment old Jack Bell out of his life. And this was a startling announcement. Most unfortunate under the circumstance, because too many were unwilling to believe it. It created a profound sensation. Mrs. Kate Batts was the wife of Frederick Batts, who was terribly afflicted, and she had become the head of the family, taking charge of her husband's affairs. She was very eccentric and sensitive. Some people were disposed to shun her, which was still more irritating, and her sensitive nature, no harm could be said of Miss Batts. She was kind-hearted and a good neighbor toward those she liked. Mr. Gunn, of course, did not believe the witch's statement, nor did any of the bells. And that is where we're going to stop tonight. So what do y'all think about that? The official story is, and the one that is most widely known, is that she's Kate Batts' witch. And we'll get into who Kate Batts is tomorrow, because there was a whole thing with Kate Batts.